Greetings. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we are going to be covering Unit 4, which is the Learning Unit. And I know that a lot of you guys didn't enjoy this unit that much, but I'm excited to have a chance to teach it again and redeem myself because I think I really figured it out by the end. So I'm excited to impart my newfound wisdom of how to teach this unit better. All right. So let's get started by talking about the definition of learning, of course. Learning is just the process of acquiring, through experience, new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. And when we talk our next video about memory, we know memory is just the indication that learning has persisted over time. So learning is something that is long lasting and it's gained through experience is the big thing here. Okay, so we're going to get started with the two overarching types of learning. So there's cognitive and associative. Associative is what we're going to get started with first. And I put these kind of on the spectrum from nature to nurture. And if you think of where our psychological perspectives, the 7 of those fall on the nature and nurture spectrum. Cognitive is kind of in the middle, and behaviorism is very far to the right when it comes to being more environmental and nurture. And that's not to say that cognitive is way over in the nature, because observational social learning is something that has a lot of social influence, but it also has the cognitive component of thinking that kind of puts it to the further right of the cognitive perspective. Associative learning that I'm going to hit on now is just learning in which you're associating things together. It's kind of our most basic learning. It's not very complex like when you think of learning from a book and studying for a test. And that is because it's the behavioral or behaviorist form of learning in which they don't really care about what's going on in our mind. They think our mind's a black box that's too difficult to understand. So they just want to focus on all the external influences in our world that are kind of causing us to behave in a certain way. So the two main forms of associative learning are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And an easy way to remember that is because classical conditioning and operant conditioning both end with conditioning. And conditioning, just so you know, means learning. So just it's a synonym for learning, really, is what you can think of it as. Okay, so let's break down our two types of associative learning. We know that associative learning is just when you're associating two things with each other. It's kind of that basic form of learning. And the most basic type is classical conditioning. So main thing we need to know is that classical conditioning is when you're associating a stimulus with an involuntary behavior or response. So providing a stimulus or just something kind of in the environment, it's going to evoke or elicit a certain involuntary behavior or response. And the key, most important thing you need to know about classical conditioning is that it's involuntary behavior. So you can think of reflex like startle reflex, jumping, not even jumping because that's almost voluntary, but your heart rate going up, sweating, kind of that initial fear response, or just emotion that you can't help, like fear, surprise, etc. So it's an association between a stimulus that then causes you to have a certain involuntary response that you can't help. It's just kind of a natural thing that's going on. Then operant conditioning kind of flips it. So whereas in classical, it's a stimulus then that causes a behavior. Operant conditioning, it's a behavior that is then getting rewarded or punished. And based on that reward or punishment, it'll either happen again or not happen again. And the key thing to note about operant conditioning is that it's a voluntary behavior, that you have control and conscious control over whether you're going to do it or not. And getting rewarded or punished for that behavior is going to determine whether you willingly, consciously are going to do that behavior again or not. So my biggest advice in kind of determining between these two things of classical conditioning and operant conditioning is if you see something talking about rewards or punishments or reinforcements, you can be pretty sure that it's operant conditioning. If you see an involuntary behavior or reflex like fear or something like that, that's very basic and primitive, classical conditioning. But really, the reward or punishment is what's going to set it apart as being operant conditioning. So let's get started with classical conditioning first. So we have our magical formula here. And remember, I said that a stimulus is just something that elicits or causes a certain response. And a key thing that I want to note is that conditioning just means learning. It's a fancy synonym for having learned something. So before conditioning means before the learning is occurring. So this is just kind of the basic what's going on right now. And then during conditioning is acquisition. So acquisition just means that now you're pairing things together and the learning is occurring because this is during conditioning. Conditioning means learning. And then after conditioning, obviously, that means after the learning has taken place. So let's start by breaking this down. The unconditioned stimulus is just the thing that elicits or causes a certain unconditioned, involuntary kind of reflexive response. And then what happens during conditioning is you take this relationship and you're going to pair something next to it. You're going to pair these two together a bunch of times to the point where now you're just going to associate them together. So your neutral stimulus is something that isn't connected to these two originally. It's just a neutral thing that alone doesn't cause you to have a certain response. Like looking at a pencil or something isn't going to cause you to have a certain response. But by pairing your neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus that causes and elicits that unconditioned response, once you do that so many times, you then change the neutral stimulus into the conditioned stimulus. And you can think neutral stimulus and conditioned stimulus are the same thing. It just becomes conditioned because we know conditioned means learning. So learning has occurred. And it now changes its name from neutral because it's no longer neutral. It's conditioned in a learned stimulus. So now, because you paired all these things together so many times, that you don't need the unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus to cause the unconditioned response. You only need the conditioned stimulus, so this neutral stimulus now, to elicit the conditioned response, this one. So let's break this down with an example, which will make it a lot easier to understand. So we have Ivan Pavlov is the one who discovered classical conditioning. He wasn't even a psychologist, actually. He was just kind of studying dogs, eating habits, or salvation and things like that. But what he discovered by doing that was that dogs were actually learning through classical conditioning. So he set up an experiment to figure this out. And he used the unconditioned stimulus of food. And he, of course, saw that the unconditioned stimulus of food causes dogs, of course, to salivate when they're hungry. So they're going to drool. So unconditioned stimulus causes unconditioned response. And again, drooling or salivation is something that a dog cannot consciously control. It's involuntary. They can't help it. When they see food, they're just going to automatically start drooling. So then now, during the acquisition or during the conditioning learning phase, you pair a neutral stimulus, which is the bell, with this relationship here of the unconditioned stimulus of food causing, of course, the unconditioned response of salvation. The bell, of course, is just neutral. That alone would not cause anything at first, but by pairing the bell with the food so many times in this conditioning learning process, that eventually the dog will just salivate to the tone or the bell. So that means that conditioning and learning has occurred. If you are able to make a dog just salivate based on only the bell or the conditioned stimulus alone. So that's mainly it. Again, we see that neutral stimulus will become the conditioned stimulus once the learning has occurred, and you don't need the unconditioned stimulus to elicit the response anymore. So next example is little Albert. John Watson is the psychologist who took Pavlov's classical conditioning principles and said, hey, can we apply these to humans? Let's see if we can kind of train and force humans to have these kind of classically conditioned responses as well. So he set up kind of an unethical study with little Albert, and he took our little baby Albert here, and he used the unconditioned stimulus of a hammer bang. And be specific if you're talking about that. A hammer alone isn't what's causing the response. It's the banging and that noise of the hammer that's causing it. So if you had an FRQ, you want to be specific in that. So the unconditioned stimulus here is the hammer bang, and that's going to cause the unconditioned response of fear, right? It's something you can't help. It's just an emotion that overcomes you. And then we put our little white rat, Stuart Little. So we have the white rat that's alone wouldn't cause little Albert to be afraid. It's just a neutral stimulus. He's cool, he's chill with the little rat. But then when you pair it a bunch of times with the unconditioned stimulus of the hammer bang, which causes the response of fear, you pair it a bunch of times. Now, the neutral stimulus is no longer neutral, and Stuart Little, our white rat friend, becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus, Stuart Little alone, without the unconditioned stimulus of the hammer bang, will cause the conditioned response of fear. So that's our example there. So it would be good to kind of know what these different responses mean, and if you ever see them like applying them in an FRQ, kind of know what an unconditioned response is, know what the unconditioned stimulus is, etc. So important terms to know, like I said, acquisition is just the process of developing the learned response. It's the pairing of your neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus to cause the unconditioned response. And it's just the heart of classical conditioning right there. So we see the more times that you're going to pair them together, the stronger your response is going to be with the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. So again, this is just the process of pairing the white rat with the hammer slam and creating that fear response. So then what happens is now, right, conditioning has occurred, and the conditioned stimulus alone causes the conditioned response. But we're pretty smart, whether it's a dog or a human or a little Albert. We're going to figure out after a while that once you keep presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, we're going to figure out that, this actually isn't scary, and we're going to catch on and begin to go through what is called extinction and unlearn the behavior. So we're going to learn that the conditioned stimulus no longer elicits or causes the conditioned response, right? We learn that Stuart Little isn't going to be paired with the hammer slam, so we're no longer scared of him and have that conditioned response. So the way to do this is just repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus, so our white rat, without the unconditioned stimulus. And the more times you do that, these decrease or weaker your response is going to be with the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. So the same thing with Pavlov's. If you keep presenting the tone or the bell without the food, it's going to eventually cause the dogs to catch on, and the salivation is going to stop. So then once extinction has occurred, you're down here. Like you no longer, if you're a little Albert, you're no longer going to be having the fear response as a result of the white rat. Or if you're the dogs, you're no longer going to be salivating at the sound of a bell or a tone. So there's no connection anymore. You completely unlearn that behavior. But what happens sometimes is spontaneous recovery. So you went through extinction now, and there's a pause. So there's no kind of that unconditioned or conditioned stimulus, conditioned response anymore. It's unlearned, and you're living your life, you can go see all the rats you want and you're not scared anymore. If you're a dog, you can hear all the bells you want and you're not going to drool. But then what happens is after this period or pause is the reappearance of an extinguished response just randomly. So what would happen is the dog would be totally fine and hear bells all the time and be cool and not be drooling. But then randomly, it's spontaneous. A bell will ring and the dog's just going to go back and revert to that old response of drooling. Same thing, little Albert. Potentially, he extinguished his fear of white furry things. But then 15 years down the road, or I don't know, something like that, he saw a little white rat and then randomly, spontaneously had that fear response, even though he hadn't had it for a very, very long time. So that spontaneous recovery just kind of randomly happens even after it's been extinguished and there's no longer that learned relationship. Another important term to know is called stimulus discrimination. So this is the ability to tell the difference between similar stimuli. So an example is with Pavlov, you have a bell ringing. The dogs would be able to differentiate between a bell ringing and chimes, or a bell ringing and a doorbell. So they'd only salivate at the sound of a bell and not at the sound of chimes or a doorbell. They're able to discriminate and tell the difference between these two things. Same thing with little Albert, Watson's little Albert. You can see that you have our white rat, and then you have Pooh, the little fuzzy dog at OHS. Maybe you miss seeing Pooh around. So you have your white rat. You can tell the difference between a white rat and then a white furry thing like Pooh the dog. So if you were able to discriminate, little Albert actually isn't able to do this, but let's say he is, he would only have the fear response to the white rat. But if he saw something else that was kind of a similar stimuli, like Pooh the dog or a white furry blanket or bunny, he would not be scared of that because he'd be able to tell the difference and know that that's not the same as the white rat. But what we see with little Albert actually is that little Albert is experiencing stimulus generalization, and that he actually is over kind of regulating or overusing the fear. So he's not only scared of just a white little rat, but he becomes scared of everything that's kind of a similar stimuli that looks like it. So he becomes scared of things like Pooh the dog, a white bunny, white blanket, whatever. He's overgeneralizing kind of, and is becoming afraid of all white furry things. And then we see here, opposite of stimulus discrimination, the dog would salivate at a doorbell in addition to the actual bell that they were given. So now, this is a good one to know because you guys have this question actually on your FRQ. So I hope you're paying attention and actually watching this because it will help you a lot. So John Garcia is a psychologist who did research into kind of showing how we are conditioned. Taste aversions are conditioned. So an example I have is just think to yourself, if you've ever gotten sick from something that you ate, you probably aren't. You're going to have an aversion. You're probably not going to want to eat there or eat that specific food again. My example is Burger King. I got super sick when I was a little kid in my friend's car and like threw up everywhere and it was terrible. And I never ate at Burger King and had a Whopper ever again. And even just the sight of like a Burger King bag, like bleh. So here's our example of conditioned taste aversions. So we know that when you're feeling sick, it's going to cause that response of throwing up. And then what happens, conditioned taste aversions, it only takes like one, whereas something like little Albert, we see there's repeated pairings of this to cause the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. A taste aversion can actually happen in just like a one-time occurrence. So I have my neutral stimulus of the Burger King Whopper, right? Before, it didn't cause anything. It was just a cool burger, whatever. But then I paired it. Now I've become sick and caused that unconditioned response of throwing up. And, I can't help that. It doesn't feel good. So now it was just that one-time thing, right? I'm not repeatedly eating Burger King, getting sick and throwing up. But after that one time, I now have an aversion to Burger King. So the neutral stimulus of the BK burger becomes the conditioned stimulus. And just seeing the Burger King burger alone, even though I'm not actually, getting sick from it, just seeing that alone will kind of cause me to have that response of feeling gross and like I'm going to throw up or something like that. And I think you guys have all been there. So that's what I'm talking about when I put my little hint of look back at the learning unit when we're looking at taste aversions. That's what I'm talking about. So you're not really thinking sensation and perception. We're talking about how taste aversions are actually conditioned responses. So now we're going to hit into operant conditioning. The guy who kind of set the groundwork or building blocks for operant conditioning is named Edward Thorndike. And he came up with this really simple idea called the law of effect. And what this says is that behaviors are repeated when they're followed by rewarding consequences or reinforcers. And they're discontinued when they're followed by punishments or consequences, negative consequences. So this is really simple, right? We know that if you're doing something and it's followed by a rewarding reinforcer, you're probably going to want to do it again. If it's followed by something that's a punishment, you're probably not going to want to do it again. Very basic, but he's going to provide empirical or scientific evidence for this. So operant conditioning, remember I said it's different. It's conditioning is learning, but it's different than classical conditioning in that operant is a voluntary response. And it's the behavior first, then the consequence or reinforcement and punishment after. So operant conditioning is just the process in which voluntary responses are learned as a result of either getting a consequence that is a reinforcement or a punishment. And then don't think consequence is something that's bad, like a punishment. A consequence could be a reinforcer or like a good thing or a punishment. Consequence, just think of like something that's following after, like consequentially after this. So a good thing to know and be able to apply this if you had an FRQ where they're asking you about providing an example of reinforcements or something like that, you want to like put all this together. So we said our stimulus is just something that's kind of causing us to do a certain behavior. And in this case, it's voluntary because it's operant conditioning. You're willingly, consciously doing this behavior. And then the behavior is followed by a consequence. And this is where the learning occurs. And the consequence is either a reinforcement. And we said those can be positive or negative, but reinforcement's a good thing that's going to make you want to do the behavior again. Or it's followed by a punishment, which again could be either positive or negative punishment. And the punishment is going to decrease the behavior and not make you want to do it again. So the consequence is what's determining your future behavior because you're learning through that. If you learn that it's followed by a reinforcement, you're going to do it again. If you learn that it's followed by a punishment, you're not going to do it again. Decrease that behavior. So you can think that secondary reinforcers, things like the money, that's going to actually help you get your primary reinforcers in the long run, right? To get shelter, you might need to use money in order to get that stuff. So, Skinner, B.F. Skinner, is the really big head honcho when it comes to behaviorism and operant conditioning. And he is the one who provided empirical evidence, that scientific evidence, to support this theory of operant conditioning. And he did this by creating his operant chamber, or the Skinner box. And this kind of shows the impact of rewards or reinforcers on causing us to continue our behavior. So how it works is you have the rat's going to press a lever here, and that's going to release some kind of food or water, right? Just a primary reinforcer. And the little cat or rat, as we have in here, is going to discover, and its associative learning is going to associate that, okay, like the lever results in my reinforcer of food or water. Well, this is good. I'm going to repeat this behavior. So again, associative learning, it's the voluntary behavior. They're consciously pushing the lever, and then it releases the primary reinforcer of food and water, and they're going to do it again. That is operant conditioning. So an important term to know with operant conditioning is the term shaping. You guys had a lot of fun with this. Remember our demos that we did in class? Shaping is just where you're trying to get someone or something to do a behavior, and you're going to reinforce responses that get them closer and closer and closer to doing that desired behavior or response. And the way that you do this is by using successive approximations. And this is, again, just that idea of you're successively rewarding them as they get closer and closer and closer to that desired behavior. So remember, you guys all love this. You picked something for each other to do. You guys, I think, hid me under my desk. So as I got closer to my desk, you would reward me by saying something like, have the best day of your life, raccoons, or by saying, good, 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 the positive reinforcement. So the closer I got to doing that, the more you'd reward me. But if I didn't do that, you wouldn't give me the treat or the reinforcement. So it's giving that reinforcer as you're getting closer and closer to the desired behavior. Same thing when you're training a dog. Maybe you want the dog to give paw. You're going to reward it when it sits down. You're going to reward it when it lifts up its leg. You're going to then reward it when it actually lets you shake its hand. Okay, so now this is the stuff that we were not about, but it's going to be good. So we have the different types of reinforcement and punishment. So let's start first. Reinforcement is something that makes you, encourages you to do a behavior again. It increases the likelihood of you repeating that behavior in the future. Punishment is something that's going to decrease the likelihood of you doing that behavior in the future. If you're punished, you're not going to want to do that behavior and go through it again. So now we got these. And in psychology, the big thing to note is that positive and negative aren't like good and bad. Positive and negative are like adding or taking away. You can think like math almost. So positive means you're adding something to the equation. Negative means you're taking away something from the equation. So let's put all this together now. So positive reinforcement is you're adding a rewarding stimuli. So let's say you did something good, you did your chores. Now your parents are going to add something rewarding to the situation, like giving you a piece of candy. They're adding something good to the situation. Negative reinforcement is still reinforcing you and encouraging you to do that behavior again in the future. It's a reinforcer, but they're taking away something that's unpleasant or preventing something that's unpleasant. That's kind of like the example of, let's say, these ones got people mad. So you wear a helmet to prevent getting hurt. People were all mad and said, well, like that's not taking away something because the injury hasn't happened. But I put preventing. So example here with negative reinforcement would be something like if you do a really good job on your AP exam and you work really hard, I'm going to take away homework. It's removing something that's unpleasant that you don't like. And it's encouraging you to continue doing that behavior of studying. So it's reinforcing it by taking away something unpleasant or preventing an unpleasant stimuli. Wearing a helmet is going to prevent an unpleasant experience of getting hurt. So it's going to reinforce that behavior of wearing a helmet, even though the injury didn't actually happen. So now punishment. Punishment is something that is going to prevent you or discourage you from doing a behavior again. Positive punishment is adding something unpleasant to this situation. So an example would be you mouthed off to your parents. Now they're adding a bunch of chores that you have to do. You have to do the dishes and you have to take out the garbage. They're adding something that wasn't there before to the situation that's unpleasant that you don't want to do. Negative punishment would be taking away something that's pleasant. So easy one is taking away your phone. So you mouth off to your parents. Now they don't want you to do that behavior again. So they're going to add the negative punishment and take away something that was originally enjoyable and pleasant to you, which is your phone. So my advice when it comes to doing these is circle the behavior first if you're getting a problem, and underline the stimulus, the thing that's getting added or taken away as a result of your behavior. So step 1, identify the behavior first, and then step 2, identify what's getting added or taken away as a result. So let's work through these practice problems. So Nora puts on sunglasses to get rid of the glare when she's driving. So I first identify the behavior is putting on sunglasses. That's what she's doing. Behavior is just, what you're actively doing. And okay, so what's the thing that's getting added or taken away as a result? Okay, well, it's getting rid of the glare. It's taking away. And is this something that's going to encourage her to do the behavior again, or something that's going to deter her from doing it? Putting on sunglasses gets rid of the glare. A glare is something that's unpleasant. So it's getting rid of an unpleasant stimuli and reinforcing the behavior of wearing sunglasses. So it's negative reinforcement. Okay, Donna took Tylenol to get rid of her headache. Good luck finding Tylenol these days. Donna took Tylenol. Taking Tylenol is the behavior. So you identified that. Now, what is the stimulus that's getting added or taken away? It's the headache that's getting taken away. And think, do we like having a headache? No. It's the unpleasant stimulus that's getting removed as a result of the behavior of taking a Tylenol. So it's negative reinforcement. It's removing something that's unpleasant, therefore encouraging you to continue taking that, doing the behavior of taking a Tylenol when you have a headache. Now let's see here. Xander got in trouble for reckless driving, so he has to take a defensive driving class. His reckless driving is the behavior, and then what's getting added or taken away as a result is they're adding him taking a defensive driving class. That's something new that's getting put in the equation. And obviously that's something you don't want to do on your weekend. So it's adding something unpleasant to the situation, positive punishment. It's going to discourage him from reckless driving again. Anna's disrespectful and her mom took away the door to her room. We see here behavior is being disrespectful, and what's getting removed, added or taken away is taking away the door. And is that something you want to happen? No, we like our door. So it's removing something that's actually pleasant to us. So that would be negative punishment because it's deterring her from doing that behavior of being disrespectful again. And then finally, Joe does the dishes after dinner so he can play video games. Behavior is doing the dishes. And what's getting added or taken away as a result of this behavior is playing video games. He's getting that added to the equation. Now he can play his video games. It's something good. It's reinforcing it. Positive reinforcement. Okay, then the next part, and we're in the clear with all these, would be types of intermittent reinforcement. So these are our reinforcement schedules. So if you're getting rewarded, there's different theories about kind of what's the best way to do it. Do we want to be rewarded consistently at a specific time, or do you want it to be random and you don't know when you're getting your reinforcement or reward? So let's look at our different combinations here. The way that I say is best to go about these problems is first ask yourself, do you know when the reinforcement is coming? And that is identifying whether it's fixed or variable. If it's fixed, you know that it's coming at a specific time, that every Wednesday I'm going to get a piece of candy from Miss Scavone. Or if it's variable, you don't know. She could be putting candy. Remember when we had phone pockets, guys? She could be putting candy in the phone pockets on Tuesday. She could put them on Wednesday. I don't know when to expect them. And then 2, once you figure out if it's fixed or variable, then you can ask yourself, is it an amount of time that's going on, or is it a specific number? So if it's a ratio, then the reward is coming after a certain number of times of doing things, or a certain number of things have passed. Interval is the rewards coming after a specific amount of time has passed. So now let's put all these things together. So you've asked yourself, okay, the time is, we know it's coming, so it's fixed, it's specified time. And okay, we know that it's based around a number, not a period of time. So fixed ratio, and this is reinforcing a response only after a specified number of responses. So it's a specified time and a specified number. So an example here is, you know, if you're buying 10 coffees at Starbucks, you'll get one free. It's very clear. It's based on a set number. You know, if you buy 10, you will get one. It's not variable, and it's not an interval in saying that, if you come to Starbucks, once a month, you'll get this. It's not a set period of time. You could buy your 10 coffees over a month. You could buy them in a day and get it. It doesn't matter. So now let's do variable ratio. So variable ratio says that it's a reinforcing response after an unpredictable number of responses. So it's a number, but we don't know how many it is. Whereas fixed ratio, it's a set number. We know exactly what we're getting into. Variable is unpredictable. So this would be an example like scratch-off lottery tickets or a slot machine in Vegas. It's kind of a set number that they do, but it's not really, it's not really a set number, but it's based on numerical stuff. It's not a period of time where the casinos at Vegas are timed that every hour or every couple hours someone's going to win a jackpot. No, it's more kind of based on a loose numerical system rather than something that's based on time. And same thing with scratch-off lottery tickets. It's not, there's no, the lottery doesn't say, okay, every 4 days someone's going to win on their scratch-off. No. They put out a random number that are going to win, but it's not a set number that we know for sure that, every 5 out of 10 scratch-offs wins. So now let's do fixed interval. This one is it's reinforcing a response only after a specified period of time has elapsed. So this one would be like every Tuesday, if a student completes their Quizlet, they'll get candy. It's based on time, and it's fixed. We know how many periods of time has to pass. So this would be like the phone pocket one, in which you guys know every Tuesday I'd put candy in your phone pockets. The issue with that is if you know when the response is coming, you'll probably only put your phone in the pocket on Tuesday and not the rest of the days. But then variable interval is kind of like your pop quizzes. So it's reinforcing a response at an unpredictable time interval. So you always have to be on your game because you don't know when it's coming. And that's the example of me randomly putting in the candy in the phone pocket. You don't know when it's coming. I could do it on a Tuesday. I could do it on a Thursday. So you have to be always on your A game of putting your phone in the pocket or my check, right? So you have to always be doing that because you don't know when I'm going to be putting that candy in there. So this, again, ask yourself first, when is it coming? And then is it an amount of time or a number? And you guys can go through this. This is the little key that I made. But I almost think they're good. But I think asking yourself these basic questions when it comes to the reinforcers And when it comes to positive and negative punishment, doing this, I think, will be a little bit easier almost. Okay, so real quick, hitting back on, we said associative learning is what we just talked about. And we talked about our friends Pavlov with his dogs, Watson, who applied it to little Albert in humans. And then with operant conditioning, that would be Skinner. But we also, I could even add on, our friend Thorndike, who kind of laid the groundwork. And then under cognitive learning, we're now going to talk about latent learning with our friend Tolman. And then we're going to bring up Albert Bandura, who is one of my favorite psychologists, who does observational and social learning. So Tolman set up latent learning. So the behaviorists were really convinced that, not a whole lot of learning is going on with just in your mind. It's a lot based on external influences of things like rewards or punishments, or like classically conditioned associations. So Tolman actually kind of ends up refuting their idea. So he says that he develops this term called latent learning, in which learning has taken place, but it's not displayed until there's an incentive to put it to use. So he's saying that you could just be learning without really being in an intense setting or getting rewarded and punished from it. You could just be learning without really realizing it, which is often what we do. So the way that he proved this, his empirical evidence for this, is through his little maze. This is his famous contribution, Tolman's maze. So he placed rats in a maze, and there weren't any rewards or punishments, so it's not like Skinner's operant conditioning box. And he put them in the maze, and even though there weren't any rewards for them or reinforcers, the rats still were able to learn the maze just by moseying around on their own time. But we wouldn't know that they learned it because there wasn't really incentive for them to put this knowledge to use. But once Tolman instated some rewards, he was able to see that the rats used their cognitive map that they created by just moseying around to complete the course. And cognitive map, that's a good term to know. You can just think of it as the kind of a space that you're surrounding in. It's your mental map of kind of your surroundings. So my example of this, latent learning and cognitive map in your life probably, would be say that your friend drives you to school every day. So you never have really driven to school on your own before. Your friend's always picking you up. But say she hurt her foot and now you have to drive to school. So you get in the car, you pick her up, you're driving, and you realize that you don't even need Google Maps because you just kind of knew how to get to school. You used your cognitive map, your kind of mental map of your area to get to school. And you weren't rewarded or punished for that learning. That it just kind of happened on its own. But once you were put to the task and were rewarded to get to school on your own, you were able to showcase that you did actually know that information. You had that mental map, cognitive map. So that's latent learning. And then we have insight learning. And this is the type of learning that kind of is your aha, all of a sudden moment. So here it's when you realize the solution to a problem through understanding the various parts and bits and pieces of the problem rather than through the whole trial and error of trying a bunch of different things a million times. It's difficult. So insight learning is just kind of that spark, that aha moment. An example here is a very famous psychological experiment with gorillas. And what happens here, you can't really see the other one. Oops. Here we go. So what happens here is that the gorillas were kind of put to this task of trying to grab their bananas. And at first, like, they were really struggling. They didn't know how to grab them. Like, what do you do? They were presented with things like some boxes in the background or these little sticks. And at first, they didn't really know what to do. But then they just displayed this insight learning where one figured out, oh, well, if I put all these sticks together, I can grab them. Or the other one figured out, okay, well, if I stack all these boxes together, aha, I can grab them. And it wasn't through this trial and error. It was more just they had this sudden burst of insight to figure it out. So that would be insight learning. Okay. And last but not least, my favorite guy is Albert Bandura. And he's one of the most famous psychologists. He developed his observational or social learning theory. And this is just Bash and Bobo, right? You can remember Bandura, Bobo. Alfred Bandura said that we learn by observing others. It's very much monkey see, monkey do. Humans are social creatures, and we're constantly watching people in our environment and taking it in. And the reason why he would fall under cognitive learning, even though it's very social, would be because you're taking in the social information you're observing, but there's a very cognitive component. You have to think and realize, I see little Joey here bashing up Bobo. Let me think about that. He got rewarded for it. Well, I'm going to do it. So there's that cognitive piece. So even though it's social and you're observing others, there's the cognitive piece of kind of thinking about it and processing it and saying, oh, well, I'm going to do that. So observational learning is just monkey see, monkey do, learning by doing, observing others. And a very good term to know is called modeling. And this is what the heart of his theory is. Modeling is just the idea that you're going to observe someone else's behavior and imitate it. And this is a good example for FRQs of using synonyms. So if you're asked to talk about the word modeling and you say, well, Joey modeled the behavior that Becky was doing and blah, 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 you're not showing your understanding. So you use your synonyms of saying mimic, copied, that kind of thing, did the same behavior as, whatever. So this is all observational learning. Think Bandura's, Bobo's. The little kids saw the adults bashing Bobo. The adults were the model. Then the kids modeled that behavior and started repeating it by observing the behavior of the adults. Monkey see, monkey do. All right. Well, that is that when it comes to learning. I hope that breaks it down. I know that we were very apprehensive about this unit, but hopefully this makes it a little bit easier to understand. Have a nice day, you guys.